Padilla.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I know it's been a lengthy and substantive hearing. Appreciate the participation of both of our witnesses. And I'll apologize in advance for jumping into some weeds here. The questions that remain to be asked, I believe, for today do get technical and specific. And I'll start with Mr. Watson. In your testimony, you mentioned that crimes of genocide and other war crimes merely carry the generic 5-year statute of limitations when the violations do not result in death. You also stated that the crime of torture carries an 8-year statute of limitation if the acts did not result in death or serious bodily injury or the foreseeable risk of such. So take this as an open-ended question. Do you believe the statute of limitations changes proposed in the Justice for Victims of War Crimes Act are a step in the right direction? And can you just reference any data or experience in sort of supporting the suggestions for the changes?
Thank you for your question, Senator. Yes, is my response that I believe the changes to the extension of statute of limitations would be helpful to the law enforcement partners at the Human Rights Violators of War Crimes Center. And I would just highlight in support of that assessment our investigation of a Rwandan national, Beatrice Munyenyezi, who was implicated in genocide in Rwanda in 1994. And she, by way of fraud, came to the United States in 1998, and through up to 9 trips by HSI Boston special agents to Rwanda to collect information of evidentiary purpose for criminal prosecution, which wasn't presented until in or about 2000, I want to say 2010, I believe it was. But nevertheless, she obtained U.S. citizenship in 2003, right? So when we look at the context of 1994, when the Tutsi and the Hutus were engaged in those activities, those heinous crimes against humanity and genocide, clearly with the statute being what it is, there was more time, right, in excess of 10 years before our special agents and regional support team members, historians were able to work with our international partners to obtain the relevant evidence to present a viable criminal prosecution. And even so, we only presented fraud by way of naturalization and potentially perjury as 2 substantive charges that were ultimately perfected where Munyenyezi was convicted. So I would say by way of that situation and that investigation, where she was sentenced to 10 years, ultimately served about just over 7, and was subsequently deported to Rwanda and is currently on trial right now for crimes of genocide, that specific instance would apply.
That's an excellent example. So safe to say that the 5-year and 8-year statutes that I referenced serve as a disincentive for longer-term investigation, let alone identification or prosecution?
Yes, Senator.
Okay, thank you. Now, coming back to Mr. Rosenbaum, you acknowledged in your testimony that our current body of substantive human rights law is limited by significant jurisdictional, temporal, and evidentiary limitations. While the Justice for Victims of War Crimes Act would allow the Department of Justice to prosecute alleged war crimes who are present in the United States, the requirement of establishing specific intent to prove alleged offenders have committed genocide and torture presents an often insurmountable evidentiary bar. Can you explain how our current jurisdictional and evidentiary limitations would affect potential prosecutions of Russian nationals present in the United States for crimes committed in Ukraine?
Thank you, Senator. Because we don't have so-called present in jurisdiction, in general, Russian war criminals who might come here would not be prosecutable criminally for the underlying war crimes. And the Justice Department believes strongly that should be corrected. I would say also, going back to the discussion that you had, or the question you posed to my colleague, Assistant Director Watson. Statutes of limitations definitely should be expanded, as we see it, not only for substantive offenses, but also for the immigration and naturalization fraud criminal prosecutions that are often our only recourse in human rights violator cases. Those are 5 years for visa fraud and 10 years for naturalization fraud. As you probably know, it's often decades before the government even learns about the underlying human rights crimes, and by then the statute of limitations has run. That was our experience in all of the World War II Nazi cases, for instance.
Okay. Thank you very much. We'll have other questions for the record. Thank you, Mr. Chair.